Welcome to Playback with another episode of history. So I want you to picture this. It's June 28th, 1919. You're in the stunning Hall of Mirrors at the Palace of Versailles. You can almost feel the electricity in the air as world leaders gather. The Great War, the war that was supposed to end all wars, is finally over. But what if the very document they were signing, this symbol of peace, was actually a ticking time bomb? What if this treaty was less of a solution and more of a blueprint for an even bigger, bloodier war? Well, that's the mystery we're diving into today.
You know, while most people were celebrating, one man, French General Ferdinand Foch, saw something else entirely. This guy had been on the front lines, he'd seen the absolute worst of it, and he said something that was just chillingly accurate. He wasn't trying to ruin the party, he was just looking at the facts and seeing the massive flaws in this so-called peace. His words, well, they're the first major clue in our investigation.
So, that's the big question, isn't it? Was Foch right? Did the Treaty of Versailles really light the fuse for World War II just 20 years later? Let's put on our detective hats, sift through the evidence, and see if we can figure it out.
Okay, our investigation starts at the Paris Peace Conference in 1919. Europe is in shambles. Empires have crumbled, the old way of doing things is gone, and the victorious allies have gathered to try and piece together a new world, one where a war like this could never happen again. The only problem? The main architects. They all had completely different ideas about how to build it.
The fate of the post-war world really came down to these four men, the Big Four. You had Woodrow Wilson from the US, George Clemenceau from France, David Lloyd George from Great Britain, and Vittorio Orlando from Italy. Each one walked into that room with his own agenda, his own list of demands, and a totally different vision for the future. And, as you can probably guess, when you have that many conflicting goals, you end up with a messy compromise, not a solid foundation.
And this right here really shows you the heart of the problem. On one side, you have America's president, Woodrow Wilson. He's the idealist, showing up with his 14 points for just peace, a League of Nations, and self-determination for all peoples. Then, on the other side, you've got the French Prime Minister, Clemenceau. His country had been absolutely devastated by the war, twice in recent memory, and he wasn't interested in ideals. He wanted one thing, revenge. He wanted to cripple Germany so it could never, ever threaten France again. It's a total clash of visions.
So, with all these clashing egos and goals, the final treaty ended up being less about creating a lasting peace and more about punishing Germany. Let's look at the hard evidence, starting with the incredibly harsh terms that were forced on the defeated nation.
First off, land. Germany was literally carved up. It lost 13% of its European territory, which also meant losing about 10% of its population. The famous Alsace-Lorraine region went back to France, and then they created something called the Polish Corridor, which was a strip of land designed to give the new country of Poland access to the sea. The problem? It sliced Germany in two, cutting off a whole region called East Prussia from the rest of the country.
Next, they completely gutted Germany's military. The once unstoppable German army was shrunk down to just 100,000 men. Basically a glorified police force. They were banned from having an air force, no tanks, no submarines. And the Rhineland, their industrial heartland right next to France, was made a demilitarized zone. Total military castration.
But honestly, the most humiliating part of the whole treaty might have been this one sentence, Article 231, the infamous War Guilt Clause. It forced Germany to accept 100% of the blame for starting the war. Just imagine that. Being forced to say that you and your entire country are solely responsible for millions of deaths. It was a massive psychological blow, and it became the legal justification for what came next.
And here it is, the bill. Because Germany was officially guilty, they were handed a debt that is almost impossible to wrap your head around. In today's money, it would be something like $269 billion. This wasn't a number they were ever expected to actually pay back. No, this was a figure designed to keep Germany economically crushed for generations.
So, you've created a treaty built on humiliation and revenge. You've pushed a nation to its breaking point. What happens next? Well, as you can imagine, the consequences were immediate and absolutely devastating, especially inside Germany itself. The German people were outraged. They hadn't been invited to negotiate. The terms were just handed to them. They called it a diktat, a dictated peace. As the new government struggled to make these impossible payments, the economy just collapsed. By 1923, inflation was so out of control it became absurd. People were literally using wheelbarrows full of cash just to buy a loaf of bread. Your life savings wiped out in a matter of days. This just created the most toxic environment imaginable. You have widespread economic despair mixed with this deep sense of national humiliation. The middle class, which is usually the foundation of a stable society, was completely wiped out. This whole situation created the perfect fertile ground for extremism to take root. And right into that chaos stepped a man with a powerful and dangerous message, promising to restore Germany's greatness and tear up that hated treaty. His name was Adolf Hitler.
But the chaos from this treaty wasn't just contained to Europe. It sent shockwaves across the entire globe. And it really exposed the hypocrisy of the Allied powers. A perfect example of this is what happened with India. See, over 1 million Indian soldiers fought and died for the British Empire during the war. They were inspired by President Wilson's promise of self-determination for all nations. They believed their sacrifice would finally earn them more freedom from British rule. India was even represented at Versailles. But after the treaty was signed, that promise of self-determination just disappeared. Britain denied them the very rights they had fought for. This betrayal was a massive wake-up call, and it poured gasoline on the fire of the Indian independence movement.
Okay, so we've laid out all the evidence. A treaty built on revenge, a nation on the verge of collapse, a world simmering with resentment. Now it's time to connect the dots and deliver the final verdict in our investigation. Was this really a peace treaty, or was it just the 20-year ceasefire that General Foch predicted?
Now, there was one glimmer of hope in the treaty, the League of Nations. It was this brand new organization designed to prevent future wars through diplomacy. A great idea, right? But it was basically doomed from the start. In a wild twist, the United States, the country whose president came up with the idea, refused to join. Without America's economic and military power, the League was, as people called it, a toothless tiger. It was powerless to stop aggressor nations in the 1930s. And so the path to the next war becomes crystal clear. First, the treaty creates deep-seated anger and grievances in Germany. Second, the one organization meant to keep the peace, the League of Nations, fails. Third, Hitler masterfully exploits all that German resentment to seize power. And finally, the Allies, terrified of another war, choose a policy of appeasement, basically just letting Hitler do whatever he wanted, which only made him bolder. And that leads us to our final conclusion. This quote just sums it up perfectly. The Treaty of Versailles had this fatal paradox. It was harsh enough to make Germany furious, to fill an entire generation with a desire for revenge, but it wasn't harsh enough to actually stop them from eventually acting on that rage. It was, in a way, the worst of both worlds. So in the end, we're left with this really big, haunting question. The Treaty of Versailles was an attempt to make sure a great war never happened again. But it was built on a foundation of vengeance, not reconciliation. And it serves as this incredibly stark reminder that a peace that creates more bitterness isn't really peace at all. It's just a pause. So I'll leave you with that to think about. If peace is built on vengeance, can it ever truly last? Thanks for joining this explainer, and I'm hoping to see you in the next episode.